Hello, welcome back. Today, I thought I would share some tips on how to use pivot tables in Excel. This is just a short, quick video just to show you the basic functionality of pivot tables and how to get started. Obviously, there's a lot more advanced features we can get into, but we'll save that for another day. So let's get into it. As you can see here, I have a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet open. My screen may look a little different than yours depending on the version you're using, but the functionality should be the same whether you're using a different version or maybe using a Mac. But like I said, the functionality should still be the same. All right, so what are we looking at here? We have a spreadsheet that contains one worksheet called Sheet 1 and has some basic banking info. We're using a fictitious bank here for our example that has 3 branches, New York, Miami, Houston, with the list of account numbers, account types, whether it's checking or savings, and the current balance. So let's suppose I want to do, I'm a bank manager and I want to do some analysis on the types of accounts I have, how many, balances, etc. Well, one easy way to do that is a pivot table. So to do that, pivot tables are up here on the Insert tab, and there's a few different ways you can create a pivot table. You may hear that, or some books may show you that you need to first have converted your portion of your spreadsheet to a table to use a pivot table, and that's not entirely true. You can just go directly to a pivot table from your data right in your spreadsheet. So I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm not going to convert this to a table. So to do that, let's go to our Insert tab, and you'll see there's a Tables group up here, and you see one of the options is Pivot Table. So let's go ahead and click that, and you see when I do that, Excel will make an attempt at trying to figure out what range of cells I want to include in my pivot table. And in this case, it's guessing correctly. It's using the range sheet 1 and the cell range A1 through D15. And in fact, A1 through D15 is what I want to include. I do want to include my column headings. So I'm okay with using that setting. Another option here is I want to choose where I want the pivot table to be placed. Well, most times you do a pivot table, you want to create it on a new worksheet. You don't want to put it right next to the data you're working with because it can get a little confusing. So I'm going to select New Worksheet. And before I click OK, I want to show you something real quick. So I'm going to cancel out of this. Suppose you did go and bring up the pivot table option and the table range was not filled in. It's because the active cell you're working with isn't inside the pivot table or it's not next to it. So to fix that, you can just make sure you're inside the pivot table, the range that you want to create the table from, and just go back in and you'll see it's there. Or you can type it in yourself, but sometimes it's easier to let Excel do the work for us. So again, there's our range. I'm going to let it put the pivot table in a new worksheet and click OK. And you'll see when I do that, I get a new worksheet tab called Sheet 2, and I can start to work on my pivot table. If you don't have a pivot table fields pane opened, it's because in the show group here, you may have noticed that the field list option is deselected. So make sure that's turned on so you have the pivot table field pane to work with. What you'll also notice is that you have 2 new tabs, something called Pivot Table Analyze and Design. You'll need those as well to work within the pivot table. If it's not there, that means your active cell, as you see here on my active cell is A3. You're outside that pivot table range there. So just to get that back up, you just click inside the pivot table, and you'll see you have your pivot table options. Pivot table fields pane back, and the 2 tabs at the top. All right, so let's start playing around with our data. First thing we may want to do is I want to get a list of branches. So I'm going to take our branch field column and drag it down to rows. I could have hit the checkbox there. It would have done the same thing. But a faster way is to just drag the column down to where you want it to appear in the pivot table. So now I have a list of branches, Houston, Miami, New York, and something called row label. So let's go ahead and edit that and give it a proper label called branch. Give it a little more meaning. So now let's suppose I want to just get a count of the accounts that I have. So let's go ahead and drag account number down to values, and you'll see a little bit of a quirk here. Excel sees that there's numeric values in that field, so it assumes I want to do a sum of account numbers. Well, that's not really what I want to see. I just want to get a count. So the easy way to change that is if I go to my drop down here for value field settings, I change it to count. Click OK, and now you'll see it's a little more meaningful. I have 5 accounts in Houston, 4 in Miami, and 5 in New York. So maybe I want to break it down further. I want to list it by account type. So let's go ahead and drag our account type down to the column. And you'll see now I get a breakdown. You see Houston, I have 4 checking, 1 savings, Miami, 1 and 3, New York, etc. So again, it's a very powerful way to do some reporting off some raw data using pivot tables. So let's go ahead and change the label here. I don't want column labels. I want account type. Again, giving it a little more meaning. And let's go over here and say, instead of saying count of account number, let's just change that to say count of accounts. So I have my count of accounts by branch, by account type. Checking and saving. You see our total across the entire bank is 7 and 7 for 14. And then by branch, I can even play around with this further. I can put my account type under the branch, and it will appear this way. So again, just a preference of how you want your data to appear. Both will give you the same information. So that's counts. So let's get a balance. Let's remove our account type. Count of account numbers, and let's bring balance into it. Here the sum is correct. I do want a sum of all the balances for each location by account type. And you can see, for example, in our Houston branch, I have over $3,000 in checking balances. We can always pretty this up, add some dollar signs here within the pivot table. Maybe get rid of some decimal places or add some decimal places. You can play around with that if you want. But again, the same formatting that applies or you have access to in other parts of Excel also applies here inside of pivot table. So as you can see, very quickly, I was able to easily perform some analysis on my raw data by using pivot tables. Very powerful. Something else I want to show you is I can even do filtering in my pivot table. So let's suppose I only want to see Houston and Miami. So let's uncheck New York, and I can apply some filtering as well within the pivot table. Maybe I want to see checking accounts. Let's uncheck that and only show savings. So again, just showing you some of the features that are available in the pivot table. Before we close, I just wanted to show you a couple of gotchas with working with pivot tables. One of those is you have to make sure that the data you're working with is contiguous. So let's suppose I have some spaces in between. Let's go and I'm going to copy these down for the purposes of this example. And you'll see there's a couple of spaces in here. So now if I created a pivot table, let's go back, insert, pretending I was doing a new pivot table, insert pivot table. You'll see once again, it only selected the range where it stops at the space, at the lines that have nothing in it. So just make sure you have no blank lines. So if I go and remove these, and now do my insert pivot table, you'll see I now have included everything all the way down to row 29. So that's one gotcha I wanted to point out. Another gotcha is I'm going to undo that, go back to our original table here, or our original view of the rows in the table, and I'm going to change the branch. Let's change. All right, let's do a replace. To do that, right, we go to our Home tab, do a Find, Replace, and we're going to change New York to LA. And do Replace All, and you'll see it made 5 replacements. Changing these 5 rows. Now if I go back to my pivot table, you'll see it still says New York. Now why is that? It's because pivot tables don't change dynamically. They don't change in real time. So in order to change my pivot table to reflect the change we just made to Los Angeles, I have to go up here to my Pivot Table Analyze tab. And you see there's a data group, and one of the options is Refresh. So go ahead and hit that, and it will refresh my pivot table with the latest version of the data. And you'll see here it did in fact change it from New York to LA. So that's another gotcha I wanted to show you real quick. Before we close out, there's one additional feature I want to show you that again is a real powerful feature of pivot tables, and it allows you to drill down into the detail within the pivot table. So suppose I'm looking at this pivot table and I want to see what rows make up the Miami branch savings accounts. So if I go to my cell C6, where it has that value, there's 3,900 there. Well, if I double click that value, you see I get a new worksheet that has just the Miami branch with those savings account types. And you'll see there's the balances. So again, it's a very powerful way to use pivot tables to see what the underlying data looks like. Now, I could have done that. I could have come back to my sheet, turned on some filtering to get to the same result. But sometimes it's easier just to go to the pivot table and drill down into that. We can do filtering in another session, but I did want to show you that feature in closing. So hopefully you found this informative. If you had any questions, please email us. Or if you want some other videos you want to see, again, please email us. Also, remember to subscribe to our channel, as I will be posting future videos. Thanks, and hope you found this informative.